About 15 seconds. Stand by.
Well, good evening. You're listening to the Legends Community Show here on thepowervoices.com. I'm your host, Greg Bell. And guys, this is going to be a pretty interesting evening. Coming up on the air, we're going to have one of my former teammates moving into these new uncharted areas. Like I said, it's going to be a very interesting show. Want to talk college before we kind of jump into the NFL. Want to talk about some of the big upsets this week, guys. Oklahoma losing to Iowa. And all I can tell you, if you think about this, this is probably about as big an upset as any upset you can probably come up with in college football. We're talking about Oklahoma at that time ranked 2 and 3 on the national polls. About now, of course, I'm always going to be a little biased because Notre Dame's down at like 15, 16 right now. They were 24th starting the week, and these preseason polls they're just all out of whack, and it almost becomes one of those situations where you're wondering why even discuss talking about polls the first 5 or 6 weeks of the NC2A set on Alabama primetime television. And I know Josefa's probably crying about that one right about now, and I have to get that dig in there because Harbaugh, the savior as they were calling him for so many. All you saw was maize and poo, poo, poo. You can't even call it blue no more. They were just disgustedly beaten in their own home on a terrible evening. And of course, now we're hearing, of course, you have 5 turnovers. What can you say? Well, Michigan State had 0 turnovers. They played in the same poor conditions, same rainy field, but they controlled the ball all 4 quarters, putting a tremendous dent into, Harbaugh. He threw the ball for 25 yards. He ran the ball for 35 yards, and he even had 2 sacks and 8 tackles. Come on now, that's an Iron Man for you. This is a guy who's out there playing always, and it's just amazing to hear all the good things that this guy is doing for his team. And what did Iowa State do? They got a 38-31 win over, at that time, presently number 2 rated Oklahoma. And it's just amazing to think about these teams right where we are right now. Hey, guys, before I get too far, I'll bring on a dear friend of mine. I know he's on the wire. I want to get him on the phone right now and talk to him a little bit because there's so much going on. No, they tell me no. But I do want to get him on. Let me know as soon as he actually jumps online with us, and we'll get Leroy on. But back to college while we're still talking about it. How about Nick Saban? Funniest quotes of the season right now. Is Nick Saban the genius of basically manipulating everything? Players, coaches, media. Did you see his interview? Nick basically reprimanded the media. I mean, he took the time to scold the media on basically telling his players how good they are. And it's just funny because I've known Nick a lifetime. I can almost tell you what he's doing on the flip side of things. He walks into the locker room, he looks at his players and goes, see, look at you. You believe everything that people say about you, you're going to get your behinds beat. You're going to lollygag, you're going to mess around, and you're going to just let them tell you how good they are. He's a mind control coach, and this is the guy you want leading the troops, especially at the college level. Nick's it's almost funny. Nick Saban, Lou Holtz, Pete Carroll. These are 3 great college coaches that had no purpose in the pros. They didn't have it. They didn't know it. They couldn't make the transition from college to pro. Nick Saban is the best, man. I'm going to tell you what, I just enjoy when he gets going on his tantrums about players, what they got to do, what they don't do. It's just hilarious to listen to him go back and forth talking to the media. And he's just great at one-liners. He gives you everything you want to see. He'll probably give us a great one-liner next week when they destroy whoever the next opponent is that Alabama's going to destroy. But still, he's trying to get us to believe that he doesn't have a masterful team. He doesn't have a dominating team. All that and much, much more. Guys, you're listening to the Legends Community Show here on thepowerofvoices.com. Of course, I'm your host, Greg Bell. Going to talk about the Rams before we jump on the phone and talk to some of the guests. But the Rams this week got a big loss. And, is it going to be a devastating loss to them? No, it puts them in second place because, of course, head-to-head gives you a nod. Seattle 3-2, the Rams 3-2. And the Rams are one drop pass. And that's really what you got to say. And you got to feel really good about the Rams right now if you're a Rams fan. They're one drop pass away from being 4-1 right now and commanding lead of the NFC West. Seattle could have found themselves at 2-4 in second place. I mean, let's face it, the Chargers, the 49ers have one win, and the Rams are sitting in a really, really good position in the NFC. You got the New York Giants over there that's going to probably end up with 1 or 2 wins this entire season. And how funny is that when you say the word New York Giants and you say 1 or 2 wins? I mean, it's almost unfathomable to talk about New York being that far back. We knew it was going to be one New York team. Of course, we're talking about the Jets, but it's now looking like the New York Giants. Odell's down. Brandon's down. I mean, they've lost 3 receivers in 1 week. They're down to 1 receiver. Ring, ring, Antoine Bolden. You hear him calling for you? But, of course, that's one guy probably won't want to come and work for the winless Giants right about now. And, of course, we're going to get into the discussion since we're in the NFL. We're going to get into the NFL discussion about the Miami and the Miami line coach. And I say that, no pun intended, doing lines in the office before he goes to a meeting. You have to ask yourself, what the hell was this guy thinking before he went into this, before he turned his phone on and started talking to the phone, saying, I'm doing this before I go into the. Can you believe this guy? And the question is, it's kind of funny to hear people start to say, well, the guy needs help. Well, yeah, he needs help, but stupidity is what stupidity does. Is that what Forrest Gump would have said? The guy actually did the lines, taped it himself. No one else was around. He was taping this incident himself, and then he sends it to, I guess, a girlfriend who would you send that to? If you're really thinking about it, how smart is this guy? I mean, that's just one equation of stupidity that I don't think I can ever get, I don't know if I can ever go that low. That, this is like a teenage kid that takes pictures of himself to send to his girlfriend. What was this guy thinking? And I don't know if you guys know it. He was the highest paid offensive line coach in the NFL right now. I don't know. I mean, what do you say to a guy who does something that's so idiotic and then you want to say he needs help? I'm trying to figure out what type of help does this guy need? Because, he'll get his help to get over the substance abuse, I'm hoping. But is he smart enough to do that? And will Miami be gracious enough to send him through rehab? There's no reason that they have to. We talk about this all the time with different players and different things of that nature. When crack cocaine hit Los Angeles, they didn't send the users that were using crack to an epidemic. They were finding ways of sending these kids to prison and then giving them 3 strikes on top of it. So I'm not so sure where that graciousness all of a sudden comes from in Congress that we have to all of a sudden help every single person when back in the 80s, all they did was put them in jail. So you tell me. I'm just curious what you think about that. and came out with a press conference and press release saying what they're going to discuss on Tuesday. You know, I don't know what the legalities, and that's why we'll talk to Mike Lowry at the bottom of the hour to find out what he thinks some of the ramifications could be for the National Football League. And how do you change your bylaws or your working agreements in the middle of the season? How do you do that? I'm just curious, and we'll ask Mike to try and get some clarity into what they could actually do in basically right in the middle of season. And these are some things that are somewhat what you could say constitutional rights. I'm not a lawyer. That's why I brought a lawyer on, and we'll be able to dive into that a little bit more at the bottom of the hour. But I'm just curious, guys. You know, the NFL has made a stance. I thought 2 weeks ago they were making a stance when they locked arms, and Jerry took a knee. And I think one of the things that has been lost in this whole crisis is talking about what the initial crisis was, and that was about equality. And many people probably tend to forget the fact that when Colin Kaepernick first protested, he sat on the bench. And he had a meeting with a Green Beret officer, and that off the national anthem, he decided not to stand but to kneel off of the advice of this Green Beret. That's been lost. These are, you know, here's a military officer telling him to take a knee instead of sitting. And now they have a problem with the kneeling. So now nobody can kneel. And in essence, nobody can disrespect the national anthem. And here's the thing. I've told everybody, and I told you here the last few weeks, this all came about out of money. In 2009, the National Football League was approached by the armed forces, paid them millions of dollars because they found out when the National Football League stands for the national anthem, enrollment in the military goes up. So all of a sudden they take the money and we start standing. Never before, I told you, never before did I ever stand for the national anthem. We were in the locker rooms. So my question is going to go to Jerry Jones, is that what happens if the players decide, basically, is it a disrespect for them to stay in the locker room? In the locker room, not in the tunnel, but stay in the locker room. And after the national anthem is played and they get ready to start the naming of the starting lineup, those guys that stayed in the locker room can come out. Is that considered a sign of disrespect? I don't know. I mean, this has become a real curious, I don't know how to say it the right way. It's become something almost like a quagmire. There's no right, there's no wrong here. You know, we're talking about standing for the national anthem. And I think that's in another thing that's been lost, that Colin said that he was that we know as the American United States Congress and government was created through protests. And it wasn't a peaceful protest. You know, I just, you know, it's really taken a completely different road. And here's the thing that I think, if there's one thing that I can tell you that I think is definitely happening here, you're starting to see a divide of the players in the locker room. And that's something that really scares me, because the one place that I always found comfort and peace was in the locker room. Never did we have a divide. We always had unity amongst our players, whether white, black, or others. You know, let's be honest, there were very few Hispanic game at that time, and there were no Asians in the game at that time. So here we were, Caucasians and blacks, and we were one. I mean, we went out there and we battled, we protected each other as one. I know many a times Kevin Green got in fights over me, and I got in fights over Kevin Green. So here all of a sudden we get in this divide. There are people of color that want to stand and want to protest. Some want to kneel, some want to stand. Then you have those of Caucasians. And remember, I've seen some of the comments by some of the Caucasians that are in the National Football League, some of them married to African American women, and they understand some of the concerns that she has, or their kids are going to have to. And I think anybody will agree with this. If you plan to make a protest, you better take advantage of the light when it's at its brightest. And for most of the National Football League, that's, of course, when these kids are playing or when they have the opportunity to have the camera focused on them so that they're protesting, so that you can go to a higher education, so that you can, ride on the bus and not in the back of the bus. There's so many things that other people have gone out and done, not for themselves, but for others. And I think that's something that these players are trying to do, never be able to get their voices heard. And I don't know. And it's amazing because when you start thinking about some of the laws that are here for the United States, there are some U.S. codes that basically, I was reading today that when Trump made his threat or told the owners of the National Football League, he made that threat to them that they should fire these guys. He impeached himself because there's a constitutional code. I think part 1. Hold on. What did I say? I actually saw it. I think I saved it. So I want to pull that up just because I have it right here in front of me. It's or an employee of the government. And I could read this entire thing to you, but he basically told a private entity, the owners, that if these guys disrespect the flag and the national anthem, they should be fired. And by saying that, he just broke a constitutional code. But man, I tell you what, there's a lot of legal things that we could be jumping on, talking about. But, I'm going to do this the right way, of course. You're listening to The Legends Show here on thepowerofvoices.com. I'm your host, Greg Bell. Joining us on the phone right now is a dear friend of mine, former corporate attorney, and now he's into the private sector, Mike Lowry. And Mike at one time was actually an agent a certified agent with the National Football League with ProServe. Mike, thanks for joining us here on The Power of Voices.
GB, hello. How you doing?
How you doing, man? Man, I'm doing pretty good. We're going to kind of dive into this. I mean, you're rating Dallas, too, so this is a good thing. I'm sure Dallas right now is buzzing with talk about Jerry Jones. Mike, let me ask you just off of the top of our head. Okay. Jerry makes a statement to the owners that basically, you got these SOBs, and I'm just going to say what he said. These son of a bitches players that are basically protesting and disrespecting the flag. Now, mind you, it's never been about disrespecting the flag. From what I remember Colin Kaepernick said, he said, I won't stand for a national anthem that basically people aren't getting the same equalities. So it never was a representation. He never even talked about the flag, but the flag is something that the other side wants to bring out just to kind of divert really what the protest was about. But now all of a sudden Jerry makes his comment. What legal, can you change a working manual in the middle of a work year in the calendar year? Or, what are the players facing right about now?
Well, the question is, now the manual certainly exists. It is, I believe, the same operations manual, actually, Greg, that you used to use when you worked for the league in enforcement.
I know. I understand.
When that policy, the current policy went into effect, I am not certain of. But let's assume that that rule has been in effect since the last collective bargaining agreement. Let's just assume that for point of discussion. As you know, when you sign your contract, you as an NFL player, you submit to a clause to obey the rules of the league. I believe it's paragraph 14 in the present form of the contract, of the agreement. But what's actually interesting about even that language, it's paragraph 14. Players will comply with and be bound by all reasonable club rules and regulations in effect during the term of this contract. Now, frankly, there's an argument as to whether this is a reasonable rule. There are other, as I heard you discussing before, there may be, frankly, constitutional principles. There are other employment principles that may be involved. There's a question as to, and we can get into a broader, deeper discussion. I'll just say this. People are assuming because this would appear to be collectively bargained that, in fact, the players are done. They're dead. They have to do it. But in actuality, to the extent that this is a First Amendment statement, there's a question as to whether an individual's First Amendment rights can be collectively bargained away. So that's one of the legal issues that's there. And frankly, as you said, and I don't want to get too far afield, whether this involves the flag, the anthem, etc., that's someone else's statement. The players have said what their statement is. So to suggest that what they're saying is not true about the anthem itself. And however, I think that does, it ultimately is going to create some issues, or it could possibly create some issues, depending on how aggressive players want to be with it, I believe. And I'll just say this one thing to set up what could come next. And again, depending on how aggressive any individual player wants to be or a group of players wants to be. What people are not looking at generally in the coverage that I've seen is that constitutionally, the freedom of speech is not just your right to say something. Again, that relates to the government. All First Amendment issues, by and large, relate to the government cannot enact rules, laws, etc., that inhibit your right of expression. But inherent in that, even with the government, is the government also can't compel you to say something. Now, ultimately, there'll have to be a determination of whether any of this relates to private parties. But to be forced, frankly, to stand up for the flag and the anthem is actually forced speech. There are a long line of cases, Supreme Court cases, that say, and it started back in the 40s. I believe the first one was in West Virginia versus Barnett, or actually it's West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. And the Supreme Court recognized that, and this was a religion case, but the Supreme Court recognized that to force, in that instance, children to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance and to salute, while the objection was religion in that case, the opinion, in my estimation, I think subsequent opinion, expanded beyond religion, in essence to say that in that instance, the government could not compel speech. So the question here is, if speech, in this instance, speech is always a First Amendment right, the question I would have is, can your right as an individual be collectively bargained away? Or can you still assert, because it is a fundamental right, can you still assert a conscientious objection to it? So given what Jerry Jones has said and what Ross down in Miami has said is, you guys are going to stand up, that's forced speech. Now again, as I said before, the law covers the state, but the question that players can raise is, can my fundamental right to be compelled to make this statement, the statement of allegiance, can that be forced upon me by the collective bargaining agreement? I think it's an interesting legal issue that some aggressive lawyer may take up and some player may want to take it up.
Well, that's interesting, man, because I don't think I've even heard that approach from that standpoint. Maybe, what is it, Demarius? Maybe that's what, what is it?
DeMaurice Smith.
DeMaurice, that's right, DeMaurice Smith. Maybe that's what they're getting loaded up to take advantage of. Because when Jerry came out and said it, it almost basically threw a dagger into everything. Because Mike, and we've had this discussion. These aren't employees; they're independent contractors. Every guy has an independent contract set up for his working ability, and there is sometimes unity. But I was one of the members who tried to hold a strike together as the second man in charge of the union reps when I was in Buffalo, and it's the hardest thing in the world to bring 56 guys and say don't cross, or 56 guys do this. Without that unity of all for one for all, it's almost impossible. So the fact that Jerry's put his gauntlet down and said, this is what I'm going to do, and he's already come back and said, I don't care if it's Dak Prescott, Ezekiel Elliott, Des Bryant, if any of them disrespect the flag, they won't be playing that week. And
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. And I said, and the most amazing part about it is he won't even let them take a knee now. He wants them all. And like you say, like I said, it was interesting to hear that fact about he's basically demanding that speech from them right now. And maybe he's breaking more laws than we even think.
Well, I don't know if he's breaking the law. And again, as I said, that's a First Amendment provision which applies to the government. Again, the government can't force you to make a statement. Many Supreme Court opinions on the subject have acknowledged even that the Congress, from the outset of the country, never made observation of the flag or saluting the flag compulsory. Think about that. Well,
I'm telling you, I have never in my playing days in the National Football League stood for the national anthem, because we were in the locker room when the national anthem was being played. It was never a part of our regime. It didn't start until 2009 that players were required to stand for the national anthem. So let's face it, I was long gone and done. I'd been out of the National Football League almost a decade then, 2 decades.
It raises, to me, an interesting issue. The background that I've heard on this is that the players standing for the anthem was part of a marketing campaign that the league was being paid for. So the other issue there is that revenue, the players are being forced to be a part of it, if you will, is that revenue included in the collective bargaining revenue? So Jerry Jones is fond of saying, my money don't get mad. That's an expression that people talk about down here all the time, that he does not let his temper or his feelings get in the way of him making money. But I think there are a couple of issues.
I don't know about whether it stands in the way of getting his money, but the one thing that he's allowed, and I think all 32 officials, and I hate to use it in this facet, but they've all been punked by Donald Trump. He's basically told them how to run their business.
Let me say this, Greg. You've known me for a long time. I was an in-house lawyer for a variety of companies, etc. I will say that, in my opinion, I have never seen a potentially explosive issue handled so poorly by professional people or professional organizations as the owners handling this issue. And I say that because anybody should have seen this coming. And frankly, it could have been cut off very simply by somebody inviting Colin Kaepernick to camp. Now the
but they had already gotten together as boys.
Has been mentioned on occasion around the country. You might remember when Michael Sam was coming out of the University of Missouri a few years ago, and there was the thought that the league was not going to let him go undrafted, frankly, because they were concerned about backlash from
the LGBTQ community. Yeah.
Right. This, to me, was a similar circumstance. They should have seen this coming. But for me, it's actually more problematic It's more problematic for this reason. Now, how deep do you want us to go here, Greg? On the sociological scale, if you will.
Give them what they got to hear.
Here's the problem for me as I've observed this. I want to make a broad statement, but I think it's true. Because of the business that NFL owners operate, each of those 32 or 31 people, since the Packers is not owned by an individual, each of those 31 people, frankly, know more black people, perhaps than any other white person in their town. Think about that.
True.
I would challenge someone, if they're listening in Dallas. Jerry Jones, you think about his own Cowboys, about 28 years. If we operate with the number that the league at this point is 70% or in excess of 70% black, on average then you have 37 black players on the team, somewhere in there, and it would vary over the course of season. But if you do the math over 28 years, 37 players, now again, there are going to be some guys who stayed, guys who were there for many years, guys who were there for a few. But roughly, it's going to come close to 1,000 guys. Jerry Jones probably knows, just professionally, and this is not just him, but each of these owners knows about 1,000 black men and their families. The tragedy of this to me, again, is I would challenge someone in Dallas, Boston, Chicago, etc. I would issue a challenge, a bet. Find me another white man that knows 1,000 black people.
Yeah. And it's even more than that when you start really thinking about the number. I mean, that's just of his Dallas Cowboys players, the number of players that have come through that he's just befriended because they were Hall of Fame guys or all-pro players.
Exactly.
Jerry knows maybe 2,000 because he was in college as well.
Right. Now,
all the college kids.
So I don't leave that just hanging.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly in this time, this political time, this cultural time, the great divide in America, frankly, is we don't know each other. You know my background, I know your background. And I'll add this in so the people listening will understand. And maybe it doesn't matter to them. But, you know, I grew up on the south side of Chicago.
Right.
And I'm almost 60 years old. My formative years were in the 60s and the 70s. But from the time I was born, to the time I was 18, I did not know a white person my age.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to me, all of this is significant about the differences that we're seeing in the perception of what is being done by the players. Again, I didn't know a white person my age until I left Chicago and went to college. What's the significance of that? In that time period, I was born in 1958. The 1960 census said that 88% of the country was white. The 1970 census said approximately the same. 88% of the country was white. I lived in the second largest city in America and did not know a white person my age. That means I grew up in a different country.
Mm-hmm.
You hear what I'm saying?
Yep.
If I am foreclosed, and it was institutional foreclosure, from meeting 88% of the population where I live, 88% of the people that I will have to live the rest of my life coexisting with, I'm in a different country than the rest of that 88%.
Right.
So that's the backdrop in which I was talking about when I was talking about the numbers of black men that the NFL owners know. Given the fact that this is still the case in Chicago, probably in Los Angeles, Detroit, Baltimore, other major cities. Young black men don't know young white men, and most white people don't know black men. These 32 up the phone and said, this is bigger than his protest. Young man, what are you thinking? How can we help? It is a tragedy and a travesty, in my estimation, And I know some of the owners, and I believe some of them to be good men. I don't think there's a more decent man in America than Bob Kraft. I've known Mr. Kraft for over 20 years. I don't think there's a more decent man in America. I think that these guys have just missed the magnitude of this moment. And if you can indulge me just for a moment, I've given a lot of thought to this. This year is 70 years since Jackie Robinson integrated baseball.
Right.
And that was in large measure due to the efforts of Branch Rickey. And 70 years ago, Branch Rickey went against convention, went against the desire of his peers and contemporaries, went against the nation, and said, this needs to be done. He didn't know Jackie Robinson.
Right.
The tragedy here is these guys knew Colin Kaepernick. Somebody knew him. A lot of them knew him. He went through the scouting. He went through the combine. He took the Wonderlic test. He played in the league for several years, went to the championship game, went to the Super Bowl. Is his thinking an unpardonable sin? Is that the unpardonable sin that the owners are saying, we can't use you anymore? That is a tragedy to me. These guys are in a better position to change America than perhaps any group of people who have ever existed in America, with the possible exception of the United States military. Right. But beyond that possible exception, I don't see in history, certainly a small group of private business people who have access, influence, and the ability to, as people like to say, start the conversation, lead the conversation, and see it to a fruitful end. That's the tragedy of this to me. Right.
And another tragedy is the divide, I think, that's going to come from this. As I was telling the listeners before we came on, one of the things that I'm actually starting to see, you see it in the Rams, you see it in the San Diego Chargers. I just send them back to San Diego, the LA Chargers. Now that they're back here in town, you see the divide that this is all of a sudden starting to cause. And as I told the listeners before you came on, the one place that was always unity, we always were ready to battle with our peers, was the locker room. And now you're starting, you saw it in Pittsburgh with Big Ben and Villanueva. You saw it with Drew Brees spoke up and said,
yeah. But Branch Rickey changed the country and thereby changed history. These gentlemen and few ladies have that power in their hands because they know these young men. And again, probably, I'm going to say most surely, knows more black men and families than any other white man in Dallas. The Tisch, I think it's Steve Tisch, Willie Johnson, they know more black men and families than any other white man in New York.
Without a doubt. The Rooney family. You could go on for days of the different owners, the DeBartolo's. And the sad thing about that, Colin Kaepernick, is that from what I know and from what I remember of the case, he actually spoke with management before he did it. So they knew this was going to happen. So they, like you say, we're in a situation where there's a group of people, very, very wealthy billionaires, who truly could make an impact that could truly change the world, but right now they're fumbling the ball. And now the question is, who's going to pick up the fumble?
And again, in my estimation, as someone who has counseled corporations, I think not only have they missed an opportunity, as you say, it's fumbled the ball, I think by losing control of the narrative, they've opened themselves up to possibilities that could be quite unattractive. As an example, you noticed today, Roger came out with a statement after Jerry Jones' statement. And let me throw one other thing at you to suggest why that might be the case. And again, if there's some aggressive lawyers and some aggressive players, and I don't know whether that's the case. You know better than anyone. Players want to get their money, so they'll just go along. The question is, does anybody want to make the statement? The statement was originally what Colin was saying. I'll come back to that. But here's something else, frankly, that players that the owners have opened themselves up to, and I think Roger's trying to cut this off. Can't say that it's a perfect legal theory, but people around here in Dallas have been talking a lot about Jerry and his time here. That stadium that they're playing in was financed with $325 million of public money. So that raises the question under the law of whether there's a public-private partnership. So no doubt the NFL is private. No doubt the Cowboys are private. But that state money going to him, is it possible that that institution is somehow attached to the state? Now, I'm not saying that it is, but a enterprising lawyer might raise that question. What is the significance of that? Do you even want that question considered, i.e., owners want states, and the reason that someone this is, they would try to find state action in order to say, you can't force my rights with respect to the First Amendment. Again, the First Amendment applies to the state. So, again, an enterprising player lawyer might say, he's a state actor, and I'm not saying that he is. I'm not advancing that is in fact the case. But that is certainly a question that can be raised. Are you a state actor if you take $300 million of government money and jeopardize the NFL stadiums being funded by public money? There may be a lot of guys that ain't happy about that. I don't know.
Right. Well, Mike, before you came on as well, I brought up the U.S. talks about the code where it says wrongfully influencing a private entity employment decision by a member of Congress or an officer or an employee of legislative or executive branch. Trump is the executive branch, and he has basically influenced a decision of whether
that argument is there. My point overall is that
this and Trump, all of them supported Trump. Let's face that. The fact, I think it's already come out that all 32 donated towards his campaign. So, maybe they donated towards both of them. I don't know. But I've heard and read that 32 owners all supported Trump in his campaign. And the fact that they allowed him to really sink them, and basically he hook, line, and sinker, he pulled them all in. And now, with his tweeting going at the way it's going, he's basically taken the lead that says, they've listened to me. Now, these players won't disrespect the flag. They've listened to him. And right. Even Jerry, like you said, he mentioned that the president, doesn't want them to be disrespectful to the flag, even though it's not being disrespectful. I tell people all the time, I go on my knees to pray all the time. So if going on the knee is disrespectful, then, Lord knows my pearly gate's not going to be waiting. Hey, Mike, thanks for joining us. We're going to have to cut out of here, man. I hate to end you because you got so much good stuff to tell us. But we're going to check with you next week if it's some new development, all right?
Okay, Greg. It's good talking with you.
All right, man. I appreciate it. Hey, guys, I hope you got a little legal aspect. Like I told you, my man Mike will give us a lot of legal aspects as to the direction that the National Football League is truly going, and it doesn't look like a very nice direction that the league is going. Hey, guys, we're getting ready to cut out of here. I, of course, appreciate everybody tuning in to the Power of Voices to listen to the Legends Community Show. I'm your host, Greg Bell, and we'll be talking to you next week.